Our next panel focuses on people who knew how to build what Evans called real computing systems. To pursue this vision, he recruited a number of faculty, Burroughs architect Bob Barton, who you're going to hear about in this panel, and also Ivan Sutherland, who you'll hear lots from somewhere in the audience there. It's our great benefit that we'll be hearing from him about real computing systems of the future. I also wanted to recognize Tom Stockham, who was also part of this crew. He was a pioneer in digital sound recording and editing, and he later became the co-investigator of the ARPA project I mentioned previously. So let me introduce Professor Rajiv Balasubramanian, who will moderate this panel. Sorry about that. At least as much as these people will allow him to.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rajiv Balasubramanian. I'm myself celebrating my 20th anniversary at the College School of Computing. As is Sneha and as is John Rigger, I don't know if he's here, but yeah, there's a few of us celebrating our 20th anniversary too. And in fact, I was hired by one of the illustrious people on this panel. Al was a huge factor in me joining here. And this is going to be a great panel. I'm really excited to host this panel on creativity. And let me introduce them in the chronological order of them joining here, which will also be in the same order that they'll give their opening remarks, and then we'll move to questions. So first we have Dwayne Call. He was a PhD student here from 1967 to 71. And this was followed by stints at BYU, at Burroughs, and Inmos. He founded or co-founded several companies that designed and built machines, Computer Systems Architects, Modular Research Institute, Trellis, and Vinca. Next, we have Al Davis. He arrived here as a grad student in 1969. Al has had a storied career in both academia and industry. He spent time at University of Waterloo and, of course, here. His industrial stints include at Fairchild, Schlumberger, Intel, HP, and now at NVIDIA. And then finally, we have Chuck Seitz, who arrived here as faculty in late 1969. He also had a stint at Caltech, and some of the architects in the room may recognize him as Bill Daley's advisors, as Bill Daley's advisor. So, he's of our time. So I think that's a name that we recognize. He also co-founded Miricom, right? And so one of the first things that I saw when I got to grad school was the Mirinet network, right? And so when Mary mentioned that, that's kind of the bell that went off in my head. He's been elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1992 for pioneering contributions to the design of asynchronous and concurrent computing systems. He received the 2011 IEEE Seymour Cray Computer Engineering Award for innovations in high-performance message passing architectures and networks. So, as you see from these bios, there's a common theme. They've all spent significant amounts of time in both industry and academia, and they've spent that time, building actual systems, right? And so hopefully we'll get some of that insight as part of this panel, right? And so they'll each make opening remarks. We'll move to questions by you and us, and based on the last panel, I think there'll be enough questions that I don't have to lean on my pre-prepared list of questions. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dwayne.
Thank you, Rajiv.
Yep.
I think, Rajiv, don't we have about 2 hours? Is that
You get 8 minutes, and I already took 30 seconds of that. So
It can't be done. I just took all the notes I had put down, and I tried to keep them short, but I'm just going to set them aside right now. In listening to the members of the last panel, I have to tell you, it was a graduate program. It wasn't an undergraduate program, but it was so freewheeling in comparison to what the previous gentlemen have had to deal with. I came in 1967. The program really had been going in full force since about a year before. Dave Evans was there in 1966 at least. My first office mate, Alan Kay, started about a year before, about in 1966 fall, I think. And then I came along in 1967, a couple of years before these two. And I'm older than these two guys by quite a bit. Chuck Seitz is probably a year or two younger than I am, but he's on my PhD. He's a signature on my PhD. He was really one of the bright people that came out of MIT and came to Utah and taught us a lot of things. Well, anyway, I started here as a not very good undergraduate student. I had done lots of things. It took me 6 years to get my BS, which included one whole semester wiped out because I took a bunch of my roommates and we went down to Acapulco at Christmas time. Never got back in time for finals because the car broke down. The other guys took the bus up and took their finals. I stayed with my old 53 Pontiac station wagon that had a hole blown in a piston from the very sulfur-laden gas in Mexico. Anyway, right at the end of my career, I started taking a couple of programming classes, and I happened to just do one for a faculty member right at the end. I did one for a faculty member that nobody else got the solution for. The fellow who was head of the computer center couldn't get a solution for it, and he'd been working on it all weekends long. He'd run the computer for probably 4 or 5 months. And I happened to crack the nut, and he was impressed. And so when school was getting out, it was the height of the Vietnam drafting era. Everybody was going to Vietnam. I presumed I was going to go from getting my bachelor's degree and go right down and report to the draft. My wife got a letter. I got a letter, but she opened it, and she's sitting down here, and Tamara opened it up and said I was 5A. She calls the draft board and said, what time do they have to report? When? You know, so it was like right away, and they said, 5A? That means he's too old to be drafted. I told you it took me 6 years for my undergraduate, and I'd been on a Mormon mission before that. So they said, well, if he hasn't had a deferment, he's out at age 26. Everybody had deferments. Everybody did. I always signed up, but my Wisconsin draft board never processed the papers. I never noticed, and I was out and didn't know what I was going to do in the spring of 1967. The fellow that I had written the program for in the class said, you need to go to graduate school. He didn't even know anything about my not draft status. And he says, you need to go to graduate school. And I said, oh, not me. And he says, no, I'm going to write a letter. So somewhere in the middle of the summer, I got a letter saying I could come up to the University of Utah, and I was provisionally admitted. I got up there, and I remember my first day, David Evans came and took me by the arm and brought me into an office, and the fellow was sitting there. I found out his name was Alan Kay, and he says, Alan, would you let Dwayne Call have a seat in this office, and would you show him the ropes? And he did. But he was a hard act to follow, and I got to write something down here, or start something up here, because I got to make sure I stop in time. So yeah, I can't do that. You tell me, okay? Give me a good nudge when I got a minute to go, Al, okay? So as the semester started to move on, my papers finally came in the mail saying that I was admitted, because I was provisional before then. And I opened the envelope, and it said I was admitted to the PhD program. And I was shocked, because I thought, wow, if they're going to let me in, I would maybe work on a master's, because that was, right up there. And it said I was a candidate in the PhD program, so I quickly made an appointment, a rush appointment with Dave Evans, and I went into his office, and he said, you can tell, he said, you seem agitated. And I said, I am. And he said, what's the problem? And I said, I applied for the master's program. Right here it says I'm admitted to the PhD program. I said, and he said, so? And I said, that's a big mistake. And he says, no, it's not. He says, I changed your application. and I said, you changed my application? And he said, sure. He says, why don't you start out setting the goal higher? And he said, if it doesn't work out, maybe you can pull back a little bit. And then I said, but Dr. Evans, my grades And he stopped me right there and said, "Oh, are you under the impression that you got in here because of your grades?" And I said, "Well, no, I understand." And he said, "Look, let's just not talk about this ever again. Why don't you jump in, go for it." Alan Kay was unusual. He told me, first thing he told me to do was to go down to the library and read everything that had been written about computers to that date. I mean, that was Alan Kay, because he had done that. Okay, the name, it was freewheeling. There were no textbooks or anything except maybe one in formal languages that we had. But everything was done by papers that were passed around. Remember, there were no copiers. There were 2 copiers on campus, 2 copy machines on campus. One was in the administration building. We couldn't use that. And one was on the mezzanine floor of the new Marriott Library at the time. That was it. And we'd get these, everything was in technical papers. It wasn't in the textbooks. So Alan Kay went to Dave Evans and said, "Hey, these 2 guys over here," Alan said, "just spent $12,000 or $15,000 of ARPA." It was DARPA then, but they changed the name to ARPA to get the word defense off it because a computer center had been bombed that had an DARPA contract back in Wisconsin. And so Alan Kay said, "Dave, these 2 guys just spent $12,000 or $15,000 simulating the UNIVAC 1108 on the 1108. It was a learning experience for them, but Alan Kay said, "Gee, if that kind of money is possibly available, can't we get a copy machine?" And so sure enough, within a month, it was an A.B. Dick was the name of the company. So soon there was an office near our offices, and all our keys fit the door, and on the plaque was Professor A.B. Dick. And we could make copies for free, and that's where everything came from. Copies were passed around. Robert Benyon down here, I remember, had a paper that was by Edsger Dijkstra from over in the Netherlands, and it was about go-to-less programming with no go-tos. And he lost it. If you'd ever seen his truck back in those days. Anyway, he lost the paper, and Bob Barton, who had procured it, said, "You better get a new copy of that paper." He says, "I'm going to have your head." And so Robert wrote a letter to Edsger Dijkstra on a teletype, because that's what we had, teletype machines, zig, 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 no possible way of typing more than 10 characters a second. And he wrote Dijkstra a letter on that teletype, all uppercase. Sure enough, a few weeks later, he gets a letter back from Edsger Dijkstra in all lowercase. and a copy of the paper, which we all then took quickly and copied on this nice copy machine we had. And things worked that way. We got papers about what was going on at MIT and at Stanford and at Harvard, and that was how we got our information. The other thing Alan Kay did is said, "Can't we use some of this?"
Probably ought to wind it down.
Okay. He said, I'm real close. I mean, I can be real close. So the other thing that Alan Kay asked for was travel money. Normally, you got to be presenting a paper if you're going to get to go to a conference or somewhere else. But Alan Kay convinced Dave that we needed to be able to travel. We needed to go out to MIT. We needed to be able to go over to Stanford and talk to the people there and see what they were doing. And so we could travel. I went up to Vancouver, British Columbia with Alan Kay to a Algol 68 conference. Okay. It was after a couple years that all kinds of things started to happen, including people like Henry Garreau and his other 3 French cohorts arrived, and PDP-10s, a time-sharing PDP-10 arrived, some real fancy machinery. Anyway, and it just all exploded from there, but it was freewheeling. Tom Stockham, his name was Thomas G. Stockham. We found out, Alan Kay informed us, that his middle name, G, his middle initial, which we didn't know, he said stands for God. Because Tom was that perfect, you know. Okay, I'm going to shift over to Alan Davis.
All right. I showed up a couple years after Dwayne. I was a PhD student from 69 to 72. I arrived with a bunch of people that came from MIT. Some people, like Chuck here, came as faculty members. Some people came as students. And I had already been accepted to go to grad school at MIT and was thinking I'd stay there for the second and third degree, just like most MITers were doing in the day. But I decided to cast a wider net. I don't know whether I heard this directly from Ivan Sutherland or whether from somebody who had heard it from Ivan Sutherland who was impressed beyond belief. Mind you, I was also born in Utah and a very avid skier since prenatal. And I came to Utah because of Ivan Sutherland and skiing. Both forces were very strong. When I got here, I was just amazed. The biggest, in retrospect, the things that most were unique and impressed me was the quality of the people and the freedom. There were no rules. And in fact, one of my first things I did was trying to figure out what the rules were. I read everything I could get my hands on. What courses did I have to take? What Chinese menu theorem did I need to look at? And I was confused beyond belief. Well, I was pretty clueless on lots of things, so that's not a rare case. But I decided I'd get a meeting with Dave because he always wanted to meet the new grad students. I went to Dave and I said, hey, Dave, I'm a bit lost here. I need to know what the rules are. And he says, what do you mean rules? And I said, well, what courses do we need to take? He says, you need to take this number of hours because the graduate school and the university says you have to, suffer through this many hours of courses. But really, we have no rules. And in fact, pretty much every course you take is something that you can take multiple times, including one of my favorite courses that was taught by Chuck, CS 699. We met at Alta on Fridays.
It wasn't a real course, guys, but it had a number, 699.
Yes. And we spoke on ones and zeros up the chair, so it was work. The bottom line is the quality of the faculty was just amazing. You had Ivan Sutherland, you had Thomas Godstockham, as you now know. We had Chuck. We had people that were just wonderful teachers. All three of those fall into that category.
Dave.
And Dave.
And Dave. And the the thing that amazed me when I went to Stockham's, sort of digital signal processing course, he showed up with two binders. One binder were his overly organized lecture notes, which were fascinating. The other binding was the definitive answer for any question that anybody in the audience could give. At which point, it became a competition between the graduate students to come up with a stumper and see if we could find a question that Tom hadn't already prepared for. And I think one of Henry Garreau's partners, Patrick Baudelaire, was the first one to come up with the stumper. And it was deeply mathematical, of which Tom was very into that. We also had amazing diversity in the faculty because we had these, just awesome teachers. And then we had the out there guys, like Viavant. He was, let me tell you what idea I came up with this morning type. And then we had Bob Barton, who was much more of an architectural philosopher than he was a computer architect by today's standards. And so he was often preaching to us and hoping that we would come up with something that sort of fit the religion. And we also had an amazingly diverse set of graduate students as well. We had the mathematical wizards. You're going to hear from Henri tomorrow on the French Connection. We had engineers that came from MIT or wherever. We had people that were very good at programming. We had people that actually knew how to build stuff. My degree, my PhD degree says electrical engineering because I predated the department, and departments gave the PhD degree even though the CS or the bachelor's and master's degree had been, okayed by, the university administration. Anyway, we had people that went on to do famous things. Jim Clark's here, founded SGI after building his graphics chip at Stanford. We have just a bunch of entrepreneurial types that went off to make a difference. We had people that were more boring, like me, that sort of banged around between industry and academia. And I got to say, my product was not a company, and I'm very proud of my product. Those graduate students that I was fortunate enough to be able to advise, some are here. Got Shane here in the front row. We got Ken Stevens, who's faculty in electrical engineering. Got Mike Parker back here. You know, that's my legacy, and I'm very proud of that. Okay. Now, you got to remember these times. These times were, if you can imagine, there were no cell phones. There was no internet. Dwayne sort of, you know, that the copy machines were able to use paper, not chisels and stone. But we were just post-Stone Age a little bit. So it was really hard for us to, you know, go and find out what was going on in the global space like it is very easy now. So in addition to the fact that we were allowed to go places and talk to people, they brought people in. I remember in Ivan's graphics class one time, I walked in uncharacteristically early, and there was this Santa Cruz surfer hippie-looking dude that was sitting there, and Ivan comes in, the class assembles, and he introduces him as Dave Huffman. I had read everything that Huffman had written at that point. I had no idea that he was a hippie-looking surfer dude. We met, you know, other crazy people like Edsger Dijkstra, Tolly Holt, and that was very, let's say, Chuck and Tolly sort of got me going on what eventually became known as Dataflow, which is my thesis. Okay, so had great grad student peers. We were encouraged to work on impossibly hard problems that people like Ivan and Chuck and Tom would put in front of us. And, you know, we'd go up and say, okay, do you have any clue how to get started on this program? And the French guys would take the mathematical approach, and the computer science guys would say, well, crap, maybe we can approximate this with enough iterations, and maybe we'll be alive when it finishes, and things like that. So, you know, that was just a springboard for what came next. And I have to say that after my graduate school education, where I've tried very hard to work on problems that were both hard and that if I got right, somebody would care. And that advice came very directly from Ivan. I was so proud of getting the answer to something, and he said, well, that's nice. Go spend your time on something hard next time. Anyway, it was a springboard for a career, and as I look back, I'm still working because I sucked at retirement. As I look back, you know, it just prepared me for everything that came next. I was curious, I embraced the hard stuff, and sometimes I was able to put a dent in it, sometimes not. Chuck.
I was only in Utah for 3 years, but I have uniformly pleasant memories of that time. I wanted to thank Mary for inviting me to here for what's turned out to be a lot of reminiscences with Al and Dwayne particularly. And so why did I come to Utah? Short answer is Ivan Sutherland. I met Ivan at MIT Lincoln Laboratory in the summer of 1966. I'd finished my first year in graduate school at MIT at the time, and I got a terrific summer job working in Group 23 at Lincoln. Okay, that probably means nothing to most of you, but this is the group that Wesley Clark started and that built the TX0 and the TX2 and built the first mini computer and all of this. And I was a junkie for digital design, and I was going to get some more experience from the real masters there. Ivan, meanwhile, had just finished his tour of duty at ARPA IPT. IPT was the Information Processing Techniques Office of ARPA, but now called IPTO.
It's
later.
IPTO now. It was IPT then.
It was
I believe.
IPT back then. We're being very historically correct.
You young guys.
Yeah. You probably still spell it DARPA, but you know it was ARPA back then. And so he had an appointment at Harvard starting that fall, but he spent the summer at Lincoln, basically to be close to his own personal computer, the TX2. The machine on which he had done his famous work on Sketchpad. but Ivan would, wanting to do some digital design, would come in and with some logic drawings after I showed him how to use a logic template. And I would do design reviews with him. So anyway, Ivan and I hit it off pretty well. Working on some of the early parts of his three-dimensional display project. That project continued in the evenings, and through the school year. I went to work at Harvard the next summer and continued working part-time at Harvard on various parts of the Harvard 3D display. By the summer of 1968, I was consulting for Evans and Sutherland after Ivan moved here. And, but my wife and I had driven out here to visit my coworkers at ENS, and I had happened to have met Bob Barton at one of the ARPA Alta meetings with Tolly Hold and other people who were teaching about concurrency. We were well underway with the design of the early ENS products at that point. So I became acquainted with Utah and liked it very much. And remember, while all of this was going on, I was still a grad student at MIT. I was an instructor at MIT. That's the next level up from teaching assistant and below assistant professor.
Yeah, but you signed my PhD thesis.
I was a husband and father, and I had written a pretty good PhD thesis. I must have had a lot of energy back
So
then.
did Barton. He didn't have a PhD.
And it was hard keeping up with Ivan and Bob Sproul and Ivan's team at Harvard. Long story short, my wife was pregnant and had a placenta previa emergency, but my son was born on the 11th of November, 1969. My family all numerologists, so he's born on 11/11. My daughter was born on 5/5. I was born on 1/1.
Me too.
I'll show you my driver's license if you don't believe me.
You and I both checked. 1/1.
1/1, yeah. Dwayne, something else. I'm not nearly the demon programmer that Dwayne is, but we have the same birthday. Anyway, I started teaching at the university part-time in the spring quarter of 1970. But I also had to go back to MIT and pay tuition for a full semester in order to defend my thesis. A lot of my University of Utah time went into setting up the switching circuits laboratory, which was, if we had it to do over again, experience from the one that I set up at MIT, which became the most popular laboratory course at MIT, the Digital Systems Project Lab. And for all the same reasons, we heard it's really good if computer science students know what the understructure is, what it is, how computers work, and what's inside. Of course, I advised students, and I taught an experimental course on switching and automata theory, in which I tried to teach about Petri nets and this avant-garde stuff as well. And thanks to Bob Barton, I also got an interest in education generally. I got to organize a series of workshops on educational kits that was sponsored by IFIPS. And you don't remember IFIPS because it doesn't exist anymore, or does it? International Federation of Information Processing
Shame.
Societies. This is ancient history, Henry. Well, I think part of what made Utah great was that they did not try to be just like other computer science departments. As Al points out, Dave's philosophy really was the foundation of the department. You hire good people and let them do interesting, ambitious things. And he's a wonderful, wonderful man. I got to know him quite well, including going hiking in the Uintas with him and so on. When I was a professor at Caltech, which is admittedly elitist university, I several times was on committees that reviewed other computer science departments, typically with the goal of writing a letter to the dean saying they're really good, but what they need is this, 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 and this. And therefore, the dean would give them some priority in giving them what they needed. Utah was different in having they like to build real things. And unfortunately, too many of the departments are just teaching programming or coding or things like that. And it seems like you're doing fine here. When Mary invited me to give this talk, I knew exactly what or be on this panel. She said this was going to be about computer architecture and computer engineering, but it evolved into being mostly reminiscences. I did want to have a brief remembrance here of a favorite student, William C. Athas. He was an undergraduate here. Al knew him very well.
Yeah, he was my TA and a star, and I convinced him to go to PhD program, and I told him he wouldn't get accepted here. I was a faculty member. I'd make sure he wasn't accepted. But I knew this guy at Caltech that he might want to talk to. It's your story from here.
So Bill came to Caltech and did a superb PhD thesis, and was a teacher and everything else. He did some other things with low power hearing aids and so on, but then ended up going to Apple. And he became Apple Fellow number 3. Now, number 1 was Woz himself. And I never knew who number 2 was, but Bill was number 3.
Maybe Steve. Maybe Steve Jobs.
No. Steve was number 0. Yeah, okay. Bill spoke highly of his fellow, Apple fellow. Bill, and it was very sad for many of us who knew him, passed away just before last Christmas at age 62, premature. Had a wife and a daughter, and so if things had gone according to this being about architecture and computer engineering, I would have given a talk which was the highlights of a paper that Bill and I wrote together. Took a couple of months, so we worked really hard on it, and I would recommend it to you. You can't find it, though, because it's IEEE Computer 1988. That's a paper about multi-computers. And Bill and I were somewhat annoyed that a lot of the architecture papers gave lip service to programming, but never showed you a program. So we were bold enough to include the source code for 2, actually. There were originally 3, but we had to cut the paper back. Interesting, non-trivial, multi-computer programs. These are concurrent programs that spawn processes and do all sorts of fun stuff, in the paper. And so all of us who remembered Bill, the topic of multi-computers isn't exactly current today, but it is, because exactly the same programming and communication techniques, message passing techniques are what people use today in compute clusters, which you could almost say is the dominant computer architecture today. Even Al, I believe, agrees with that. Dataflow Al thinks that's true.
You're right. It's all about the data center. That phone you guys carry around, if the data center wasn't there, just a phone.
It would be.
Chuck, what made you leave Utah?
Well, that's an easy question. It was the allure of California. I mean, I liked Utah, and I certainly enjoyed skiing, and I didn't miss the beaches so much. But there was the allure of California. My consulting clients were there mostly, including Bob Barton's lab, that when he got Burroughs to set up a lab in La Jolla, California, where we would go swimming at lunch, snorkeling. And we were doing some kind of interesting work there. I was working on digital video, going back a little bit into graphics, but this was all raster graphics. And amongst other things, we developed techniques that Frank Crow also published about, but our patent is about a year before Frank's publications, about using grayscale to eliminate the jaggies on the edges of characters and lines and other figures. This was a way of getting the maximum resolution out of a raster display.
And you know something, the young people who were here just before, I call them young, were talking about teaching undergraduate programs and having to fit 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag. We were in the graduate program, and David Evans' philosophy, he told me that when I went down to teach at BYU afterwards, and he said what he did is he got the best people he could, and then the department would become what those people did and who they were. And because it was a graduate program, there's more flexibility. I remember some kid wanted to do AI at the time, which some of us used to say, oh, artificial intelligence is for the artificially intelligent. And we didn't happen to have an AI big deal guy, and so Dave arranged for the kid to go off to Stanford. And I mean, and he was not, he didn't have a problem with that. The CS department graduate program at Utah was what the faculty were. Tom Stockham came, absolutely top. He didn't do graphics. He did some image processing. It was very interesting. But he ended up being the father of digital recording. And when Chuck went down to La Jolla at Bob Barton's lab in 1971, and I was just finishing up, and we teased, I ended up being invited to come down there because Ivan and Bob Barton both told me, Ivan says, are you going down to BYU to teach? And I said, well, they've asked if I'd come, and it's my church's school and everything. And Ivan said, we did not give you the education we gave you just so you could go down and teach your guts out at an undergraduate institution. I didn't take his advice. I wish I had, because I went down and I taught my guts out at an undergraduate institution. We got Chuck's laboratory gear, his digital logic gear, and we set up a logic lab. Oh, I think we were twice the size of U of U's logic lab. We had, 30, 40 computer science students and 30, 40 EE students in tandem taking the digital logic design course. We got some of his artwork to make the circuit boards. He gave me a copy of his class notes and all, and we used that and then embellished on it a little bit later. And I hadn't taken Chuck's course, and I was embarrassed at finding that I was teaching logic design as my primary thing. And Chuck said, yeah, but you had me for a tutor down in La Jolla. Down in La Jolla, by the way, some of you are old enough to remember that. Do you remember Captain Video? The TV program? Early on, there was a TV program, and there was a guy by the name of Captain Video, and Gary Watkins is there chuckling away. And they called, down there, they called Chuck Captain Video. I had worked with Tom Stockham quite a bit, and they called me Captain Audio. And then Al Davis even came down and did a stint down there. So the three of us didn't end up at Xerox PARC. We ended up at Bob Barton's lab in
It's a
La Jolla.
very incestuous world.
And Bob Johnson, where is Mary? Mary's right there, Bob Johnson's wife. And Bob Johnson was a vice president at Burroughs of Engineering, and he's the one that put up with Bob Barton and funded our lab in La Jolla. And then later, Bob's, I forgot to tell you, location was very important, and Alta Lodge was a big deal part of the program then. And we used to have, DARPA had workshops up there. And where did I see Bob Sproul?
He's in the back.
I've seen all that time, and Bob Sproul had been to some of those workshops, and he was from Harvard, right? I knew of Bob Sproul's name. He didn't have any idea who I was, but we were there at some of these workshops. They were the DARPA meetings, people coming in from all over, not just mostly the country, I guess, for DARPA. And the meetings they would hold were up at Alta Lodge.
They were workshops.
I don't hear too well, so
They were called workshops.
workshops.
The serious
Yes,
meetings.
But they let us graduate students come up to them too, and they had nice rooms for the various faculty members, big professionals, and they had a dormitory area that we graduate students were invited to come up and stay in. And so the place was not just University of Utah on this campus, in the Merrill Engineering Building, it was also Alta Lodge.
Al, do you have any regrets from your time here? Anything you would do differently?
I do. When I was a graduate student here, it was the most fun I've ever had. Why I decided to leave after the minimum amount of time when I had achieved the right number of credit hours that they would give me a PhD is absolutely beyond me. And I should have stayed longer. Even after my advisor left, I should have said, hey, just sign everything. I'll turn it in later. And I'll do whatever. I'll do some more research, whatever. Because the faculty made it such a good place for us. We were so lucky to be at the right spot at the right time when these brilliant, inspiring faculty members gave us, young, malformed brains in my case, interesting problems to work on. And man, I could have stayed for a long time. If you're going to work for another 50 years, what's your rush in getting out early? I mean, dumb.
Plus, he's a very hot dog skier. He was the best among us.
I do want to open it up for a couple of questions from the audience. No? Sorry. Mary, no? Okay.
Oh, we did it.
All right, so to keep on time, let's wrap up here. Thank you so much for all that insight.
Rajiv, may I say just one other thing? You're rummaging through things. Henry Gros, at one time, I was in the bank going to make a loan for some tuition, and he happened to walk in the bank. He may not remember this, but I do. And he said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm making loans so I can pay my tuition next semester. And Henry said, stop it. And he got it out of his checkbook, and he wrote out a check for my tuition. Do you remember? No. I probably but right here, but right here, we found this little notebook my wife found, and on this page it says, this is a little after graduate school, and it says, Al, read what it says down here.
I can't.
It says Davis owes me for his Alta Lodge bill $56.90. You owe. No, just
we're paid up.
Just give it to Henry. Give it to Henry. Okay.